It started with a phone call that almost didn't get answered. A quiet street, a modest house, no history of violence, no neighbors reporting screams or gunshots. Everything about the location suggested normal life. But inside that house was a crime so disturbing, so carefully staged, that even veteran investigators would later admit they had never seen anything like it. This was not a murder driven by rage. This was something far more twisted. This was patience, planning, and deception. The victim was someone nobody would have expected to become the center of a homicide investigation. A routine life, predictable habits, no known enemies. Friends described them as cautious, private, almost invisible, which is exactly why the crime went unnoticed for days. By the time authorities entered the home, the silence felt unnatural. No signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle, just an unsettling stillness that made experienced officers uneasy. The body was discovered in a position that raised immediate questions. It wasn't random. It wasn't careless. Whoever did this wanted the scene to be seen exactly this way. The placement suggested intention, not panic. Investigators quickly realized this was not a crime committed in the heat of the moment. This was a message, even if no one yet understood what it meant. Forensic teams began their work, and that's when the first contradictions appeared. The cause of death didn't match the condition of the scene. The timeline didn't fit the physical evidence. Objects had been moved, but nothing valuable was missing. It wasn't robbery. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. The killer hadn't taken anything except control. Neighbors were interviewed, but no one had heard anything unusual. No arguments, no unfamiliar vehicles, no sudden disturbances. The house sat on the street like it always had, blending in perfectly, and that was the first clue. The crime depended on invisibility, on being overlooked. As the autopsy results came in, investigators faced another disturbing reality. The victim had been alive for hours after the attack began. This wasn't a single act. It was a sequence, a process, and every step of it had been deliberate. The injuries told a story of hesitation and restraint, not frenzy. Whoever did this had stopped, waited, adjusted. That level of control suggested someone who was calm, frighteningly calm. Attention turned inward. Someone close. Someone familiar with routines. Someone who knew how to enter without raising alarm. Detectives began mapping the victim's life backwards. Phone records, messages, daily movements. That's when a pattern emerged. In the weeks leading up to the murder, the victim's behavior had subtly changed. Appointments cancelled, calls unanswered. A growing sense of isolation that no one had questioned at the time. One name kept appearing. Not aggressively, not suspiciously, just consistently. A person who had been present for years, blending into the background of the victim's life. No history of violence, no criminal record. The kind of person you would never suspect, which made them dangerous. When investigators brought this person in for questioning, the tone was calm, cooperative, almost helpful. They didn't ask for a lawyer. They didn't appear nervous. In fact, they seemed relieved to talk. But something was off. Their details were too precise. Their emotions slightly delayed, as if they were performing what they believed grief should look like. Detectives pressed gently, then strategically. Small inconsistencies began to surface. Not lies, adjustments, corrections made too quickly, memories revised in real time. It became clear that this person had rehearsed parts of their story, but not all of it, and under pressure the cracks began to show. Meanwhile, forensic analysts uncovered something chilling. The crime scene wasn't just staged, it had been tested. Marks suggested previous attempts. Small changes made before the final act. This wasn't the first time the killer had imagined this moment. It was the last version of a plan refined over time. As evidence mounted, investigators realized the motive wasn't money or jealousy. It was possession, control over another human life, exercised quietly, privately, and completely. The killer didn't want chaos. They wanted order, their order. And just when police believed they understood the full picture, a final discovery turned the case on its head, revealing that the murder wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the ending. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the past became. Hidden beneath years of normal interactions was a slow, calculated manipulation that no one had recognized while it was happening. Messages that once seemed harmless now read like rehearsals. Casual comments revealed subtle control. It was psychological long before it was physical. Experts later described it as a long-term conditioning process. The victim hadn't been trapped by force, but by trust. Boundaries were gradually erased, independence quietly discouraged. By the time the final act occurred, the victim was isolated without realizing how it happened. And that was exactly what the killer needed. Digital evidence sealed what intuition had already suggested. Searches conducted late at night. Questions asked repeatedly over months. Not about crime, but about anatomy, timing, and concealment. The killer hadn't rushed. They had studied. They had prepared themselves mentally for something they believed was inevitable. During the second interrogation, the tone changed. Investigators confronted the suspect with evidence piece by piece. Each time the response was the same. Calm acknowledgement, no denial, no shock, just silence, followed by minimal explanation. It was as if the suspect no longer felt the need to pretend. What finally broke the case wasn't anger or fear. It was ego. The killer believed the crime was perfect, that it deserved to be understood. And in trying to explain their reasoning, they revealed details only the murderer could know. The confession wasn't emotional, it was instructional. They described the act not as violence, but as resolution, a problem solved, a situation controlled. That mindset stunned even seasoned professionals. This wasn't a person overwhelmed by emotion. This was someone who believed they were justified. At trial, the courtroom struggled to comprehend the quiet horror of the case. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shocking footage, just a timeline that showed how easily control can hide behind familiarity, how danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. The verdict came swiftly. The sentence was severe, but for many, justice felt incomplete. Not because the wrong person was punished, but because the crime challenged how people understand safety. This wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. This was someone who had been trusted. In the aftermath, investigators reflected on what made the case so disturbing. It wasn't the method. It wasn't the outcome. It was the realization that the warning signs were present all along, just subtle enough to be ignored. The twisted nature of the crime lay not in brutality, but in patience. This case never became famous. There were no documentaries at the time, no headlines that lasted beyond a few days. And that's what makes it even more unsettling. Crimes like this don't rely on spectacle, they rely on silence. Today, the house stands empty. The street looks the same. Life moved on, as it always does. But for those who know the full story, there's an understanding that some of the most dangerous crimes aren't the ones we fear, they're the ones we never see coming. Because the most twisted murders aren't always committed in anger. Sometimes they're committed calmly, quietly, by someone who believes they are in control. And that may be the most frightening truth of all.